this is Alan Jeremy and welcome to a complete introductory Blender tutorial. In this tutorial I'll be introducing you to the almost the entire Blender interface, and we're going to start from the top to the bottom. And I'm going to try and explain as best as I can each and every single one of these things, so that if you're a new user of Blender and you felt intimidated by the software, then you can actually gain help from this tutorial, and by the end of this tutorial you'll probably understand what each and every single thing in Blender does. Okay, so first of all, here are the buttons that I'm pressing, and I'm going to start by explaining this. Okay, so these two arrows that you can see here, up and down, one facing up and one facing down, actually indicate that this can bring up a pop-up menu which has several options, and this allows you to choose the editor type, and we have several here. So first of all, the 3D view is this view, and this is basically where you do all your work. The timeline is this one here, where you can insert keyframes for your animation, which I will explain later on. The graph editor is used for animation. The dope sheet is also used for animation mostly, and the NLA editor is also used for animation partly. The UV image editor is used for UV unwrapping and mapping of UV images. The video sequence editor is used for editing videos and maybe rendering an image sequence into a video file. The movie clip editor actually is used for camera tracking and such things, and also masking, which I will explain later on. But this is basically just an introductory tutorial to explain basically what each and every single thing does. Well, for camera mapping, you can think of camera mapping as adding 3D objects to live footage. For example, the Transformers, where you can actually see that the Transformers are not real objects, they're actually 3D objects that have been added into real life footage, and yeah, that's camera tracking basically, or in object tracking. So the text editor is used for typing in your Python code mainly and creating scripts. The node editor is used for compositing, and compositing is basically just post-processing images so as to add various effects, for example glow effects, blur effects, and such effects, which we'll go through again in another tutorial. The logic editor allows you to change the game logic of your objects, and this is used in the Blender game engine. The properties allows you to change the various properties and manipulate the various properties of your objects, as well as your scenes and preferences partly. Your user preferences, your outliner shows you all the current objects in your scene, and it is open here. You can see that it shows we have a camera, and when you click on it, then it sets the camera as the active object within our scene, and the cube and the lump. So we have three objects. Then the user preferences allows you to change your preferences, and I'm going to open it up and explain basically what it does. And currently you can't see it properly because I have opened it up through here, and when I drag this over by pressing this pressing the left mouse button on this line here, then you can see it. But alternatively, I can right click here, then maximize the area, and so here is the user preferences. Okay, so first of all, you have the interface where you can change your preferences for your interface. For example, you can show Python tooltips, and these are basically the tips that you can see when you hover the mouse over something. For example, if I hover the mouse over this, you can see info empty file. Here you can see open default file doesn't save the current file, and that is our Python tip. So this basically is used to manipulate the appearance of the interface. This is for the editing of the objects within our scene, and these are the preferences that you can change. You can also change the input preferences. For example, if you're using a laptop, you can enable this emulate numpad so that your numbers are from 1 to 0 actually emulate the numpad, which can make your workflow easier. You can also change any of the settings here. For example, select to the left and such. You can also change the presets from Blender to Maya. And next we're going to go over the add-ons. The add-ons is basically where you can enable and disable various add-ons, which are basically like extensions of Blender that allow you to use more features as well as more facilities. The themes allow you to change the colors of the interface basically, and you can change maybe the colors of the user interface here. The text style here, you can change the bone color sets here, and the 3D view and the timeline and the graph editor and so forth. You can change their colors here. The file is where you specify where you want each of the file paths to be. For example, where you save your fonts, where you save your textures, where you want your rendered output to go, where you save your scripts, where you save your sounds, and the temporary folder, which is named temp here, and by default is /tmp/. Then you can also change this, and the image editor that you're using, for example, maybe GIMP. I've never seen this actually working quite well, but anyway, you can change all these settings here. You can also change the animation player from internal to whichever you want to do, and you can also change the author here. For example, I can write my name, Alan Jeremy, and save it. You can also change the system settings here, and once you have changed and are satisfied with the settings and preferences that you have set, then you can save the settings so that the next time you open Blender they are your default settings. So you can save by clicking here, save user settings, and this saves them. And now I am going to go out of the maximized view, and I'm going to change this back to info, and this info actually contains information and was the default. So you have your file here, and under this file option you can see several options, and this new opens a new Blender file. This open allows you to this new starts a new Blender file, and this open allows you to open a Blender file. This recent opens the most recent files, allows you to open the most recent files that you had. This recover last session allows you to recover the last session before you quit Blender. The recover autosave allows you to basically recover the last saved version of the Blender file that you're currently on. The save allows you to save. The savers, these are pretty self-explanatory. Save copy allows you to save a copy of the blend file, for example, for backup. This user preferences, we've just gone over this quickly. Save startup file allows you to save the current file as your default startup file, and I can save this. When I click it, you can see that it brings up a pop-up menu, and when you click here, then it saves this as the default startup file. And load factory settings basically just loads the settings within which Blender came packaged with when you downloaded it. The link option allows you to link other Blender files, which are .blend files, to your current blend file. And the link is quite similar to the append, but I'm going to explain the difference in a moment, I think. So the link basically allows you to link other blend files to your scene, to your current blend file, and the append allows you to link other blend files to your blend file. So what is the difference between the two? The link file allows you to link the objects, the Blender files, from another file to this current file. I hope that is not confusing. But when the object is edited within this blend file, then it is also edited similarly in the original file. The append, on the other hand, allows you to link objects from other blend files, but when the object is manipulated on this blend file, then it does not affect the original blend file. I hope that was not confusing. So the import allows you to import various file types, and you can import collider, motion capture files, scalable vector graphics files, for example Inkscape files, and all these other file formats. And this is basically important when you perhaps have used a different 3D application to create something. Then maybe you save the file as an OBJ file, so you can import the OBJ file. And this is a good thing because Blender actually supports all these file formats, and there are several more file formats that are there when you enable them under the add-ons in the user preferences. The export allows you to export the current blend file into a different file format. For example, you can export as a collider file, Stanford, STL, 3D Studio, and all that stuff. So the external data allows you to pack different files into a blend file. For example, if you imported an OBJ file and you wanted it to become part of the current blend file, then you will actually go to external data, then pack into blend files. Unpack does the opposite of the blend files, of the pack into blend files, and allows you to basically just unpack and return the files to how they were originally. Make all paths relative. This is a little bit complicated to explain, but it basically makes all the paths to external files relative to the current blend. And I don't want to confuse you too much explaining this, so we'll cover this in later tutorials, these two options, but they're not that important because people rarely use them, or rather I rarely use them. You can also report missing files, and you can also find missing files. The quit option is self-explanatory as it quits Blender. Okay, now to this add option. So you can add different types of objects to our 3D view, and you can add a mesh, a curve, surface, and any of these, and they will appear where the 3D cursor is. The 3D cursor is this red target looking like thing, which can be moved by left clicking on a different area to make it appear on that area. For example, when I left click here, the cursor appears here. So any object that is added to the scene actually appears in the position of the 3D cursor. Okay, so now if we try to add a plane, you can see that it appeared in the position of the 3D cursor. But we're going to delete that. And so you can add various types of objects. Lamps are basically used for lighting. Force fields are used for simulations. For example, if you want to simulate fluids, which we will go over again in other tutorials, you can use different force fields to simulate the effects in real life as they appear in real life. Render allows you to process the image, and this is basically calculating the rays of light and how the shadows appear. And when I press this render image, it will process the current image on the current frame, and as you can see, voila. Okay, as you can see, it rendered this image, and this is basically just processing the image and calculating the rays of light and calculating the position of the shadows and all that stuff. So render animation is for rendering animations, and it will render the number of frames that are within the timeline, which currently is 250. OpenGL render, on the other hand, it renders the current view using the OpenGL shading language, which I think means OpenGL shading language. So now you can see it has rendered exactly as it appeared. You can also render animations using this, and this can show or hide render view, allows you to show or hide the render view. It's self-explanatory. Play rendered animation allows you to play the rendered animation as it says, and you can use it to play animations once you have rendered them. Under the window option, you can duplicate the window. For example, if you're using two screens, you can duplicate this window, then move one of the windows to a different screen so that you have more working space. Toggle full screen allows you to toggle between these and the full screen, as you can see, and you can quit the full screen. Oops, sorry about that. You can quit the full screen by clicking on this toggle full screen again. Save screenshot actually takes a screenshot of the entire interface that you can see as an image. Make screencast actually allows you to record a video, for example making tutorials like I am doing right now, although I am not using the Blender screencast video maker thing. Toggle system console actually allows you to see the console, and this is mostly important for developers because developers use it for debugging mostly, so let that not bother you. Help is where you can get all the kinds of help that you need to get. You can go, and most of these are actually links to the various sites, and locations of all these facilities. For example, you can go to the developer community, you can go to the user community by clicking on each one of these, and the links will forward you to whichever site you need to go to. So the API reference basically is, API stands for Application Programming Interface, and this is the reference for Blender, Python, and it is basically used by developers once again for developing for Blender. And so basically I think that's it. I don't need to explain each and every single one of these because it's going to take a lot of time, but anyway, just know that this options under the help is basically just help you gain access to any of these help facilities except the splash screen, which is this splash screen, which represents the current version of Blender. And as you can see here, this is the Blender version, which is 2.66 alpha release, which was and is the current most stable release at the point of making this video. Okay, so now you can choose your screen. This option allows you to choose your screen layout, as you can see by the tooltip text there. And when you click on this, it allows you to toggle between any of this. And each of these options is basically just a different setup for the various purposes that are there. For example, if you want to do animation, then the Blender developers have actually created a template, or rather preset, of an environment for you to do your animation. So when you click on that, it basically brings you to an animation interface, as you can see, where you can do all your animation and editing. Compositing is where you can do your image post-processing for your animation, and basically what this does is change the layout view so that it can open up a different layout, or rather template, for making the work you're doing easier. Okay, so 3D view full allows you to go into full 3D view, as you can see, with nothing else. Then animation allows you to go into an animation friendly interface. Compositing allows you to go into a compositing friendly interface, and compositing is basically post-processing your images, for example adding a glow, blurs, and maybe the camera lens defocus and all that stuff. Sorry if all these terminologies make it seem a little bit more confusing. Default is the default environment, which is what we had when we started our file. Sorry, let me get a drink. Okay, so game logic is used for the Blender game development, and Blender also has its own game engine. Motion tracking is basically for motion tracking, and scripting is for scripting, as you can see. UV editing is for UV mapping and UV editing basically. Video editing is for editing videos, quite self-explanatory. This plus sign here allows you to add a new screen, which is basically a custom screen. And you can add a new screen by clicking on this. Then you can name it whatever you want to name it. I'll name this modeling. Then you can split or join areas by right clicking on this line in between windows, and the option will appear in a pop-up menu, and you can choose join area. Then you can drag towards the direction of the arrow to join the area into one. You can also do the same with any of these edges. And for example, if I want to save this is automatically saved as my modeling interface. And now if we go back to video editing, it brings us to our video editing interface. And if we go to our modeling, it brings us to the layout that we actually created. So to delete the layout that we have created, you can press this X button and it will move to the layout that was just below it, which in this case is, that was just above it, which in this case is Game Logic. And we're going to go back to default. Okay, so this next we're going to go over this scene option, and you can select your scene from here. Currently we only have one scene, and this is the name of the scene, and you can add a new scene here by clicking on this plus button. Then you can rename your scene by simply left clicking here and typing whatever you want to call it. For example, let's say scene 1. Okay, so basically that's it, and you can also delete using this X button. Now this here is the render engines, and currently we only have 3, which is the Blender render, the Blender game, and the Cycles engine. And this basically come inbuilt with Blender, and you can activate any of them by left clicking. And now when you render, you can see that it renders differently because this is the Cycles render engine. When you go to the Blender game, you need to press P to play, which is just like rendering, I guess, real-time rendering. And you can also change this to Blender render, which is the default. So each and every single one of these comes with a couple of options which are for use within the specific render engine. For example, Cycles has a different materials system from the Blender render, and the Blender game has different physics settings from both of these, because it has the physics settings for the game mainly and for games mainly, and so this just allows you to change between any of these render engines. So you can choose the Blender game engine, the Blender render engine, or the Cycles render engine. This little logo here allows you to open the splash screen, as you can see, and this text over here, and the numbers are basically just information about the current blend file. So these the current blend file and basically Blender. So these here, the 2.66.1 is the version of Blender, and this is the number of vertices within our current scene. This is the number of faces within our current scene, which as you can see, a cube has 6 faces, and therefore there are only 6 faces in our current scene. This is the number of triangles in our scene, and this cube has 6 faces, and each face is a square, and therefore it is divided into 2 to create triangles, and therefore there are 12 triangles. This is the number of objects in the scene, and the first number here, 1, shows the number of objects that have been selected. As you can see, we've only selected the cube, so we have selected 1 object, and this 3 here is the total number of objects in the scene. So if we press Shift and right click to select the lamp also, then we have selected 2 objects out of the total 3 objects within the scene. When we select the camera also, we have selected all 3 objects out of all the 3 objects within the scene. This here, now we'll press A to deselect everything, and this here is the number of lamps within the scene, and once again this 0 is the number of active lamps, which is basically selected lamps, and we have 1 lamp, and now when you select it, then it shows that it's 1 lamp selected over the total number of lamps, which is 1. This here is the memory being used by Blender. Okay, so that's it for this top panel and all these options, which I have basically given a rough overview of what each and every single one of them does. And now I'm going to explain the 3D view a little bit more. Okay, so the 3D view is basically where you do all your 3D work. You do your modeling here, you do your basic animation here, and all that stuff happens here. You control your camera here, and basically almost everything is done here. You also rig your character and do all that stuff within this 3D view. So it's quite important to know what a 3D view entails. So the 3D view basically has these 2 side panel options, and these are the object tools that allow you to manipulate the object. For example, translate the object, which is moving the object; rotate the object, which is rotating the object; scaling the object, which is scaling or enlarging and shrinking the object. These other options are basically for manipulating the objects here. So you can duplicate objects, you can delete objects, and all that stuff. So you can close this down by going to this line here, then left clicking and dragging it to the left, and to bring it back you can press this plus here, or you can actually press T, which is a shortcut key, to switch this to toggle between viewing the object tools and not. So you can press T, and that makes it invisible, or rather shrinks it or minimizes it, and T returns it back. returns it. I think that's correct English. So anyway, now to this side. Now on this side, these are basically just controls that allow you to manipulate the data of this particular scene. And for example, you can change the transformation of the camera, of which I did. Okay, you can also undo whatever you have done by pressing Ctrl Z, and you can redo by pressing Shift Ctrl Z. And all these shortcuts may seem a little bit confusing at first, but the more familiar you get with Blender, the more you actually find them to be easier and quite helpful. So this just allows you to change the settings here to manipulate the scene, and you can also add, for example, here you can add grease pencil layers and use them to maybe draw over the scene to help you. And this is the view options, 3D cursor options. For example, the location, if I wanted to make it go back to the center, one way of doing it is by pressing 0, typing in 0, 0 and 0 for the X, Y and Z. This shows the currently selected item, and here is the name, of which if you click here you can actually change the name. And you can also minimize these options by clicking on this arrow which is facing down, and when you minimize, then the arrow faces right. So when maximized, the arrow faces down to point towards the options, and when minimized, the arrow faces right. And if you want to maximize it, then you just click on the arrow once again. So basically that's what this does. And the display here allows you to change the display settings. For example, the number of lines on the grid flow and the size. As you can see, you can change the size of the grid flow. And I'm just going to return this back to the original, which is 1. And all these other things we'll go over sooner or later, but just know this allows you to change the various things within the scene and manipulate most of the appearances of things within the scene, as well as manipulate the various transformation details, for example the rotation and all that stuff. And also allows you to edit the display and add new layers of the grease pencil. So you can close this down again by dragging this over to this side and open it up by pressing that plus, or you can press the N key to close it down, and the N key to open it back up. So now let's go over the details of this 3D view. So in this 3D view, we have a grid, which is basically our 3D virtual ground, and we have our objects. So in 3D, we need lighting first of all, we need our objects. That is the first fundamental thing that you need to do. Have your object. So once you have your object, and for example this cube, you need a light, because without light you cannot see. It is just the same as it is in the real world. If you have no light, you can't see. So it's the same in 3D. So this is a lamp, and these three arrows can allow you to move it either on the x-axis, which is represented by the red arrow, on the y-axis represented by the green arrow, or the z-axis represented by the blue arrow. To navigate around this 3D view, you can use the middle mouse button and hold it, then rotate by moving the mouse side to side. You can zoom in by scrolling in, you can zoom out by you can zoom in by scrolling upwards and zoom out by scrolling backwards. You can select objects by right-clicking on them, and you can move them on these various axes by clicking on the various arrows using the left mouse button and dragging them on the various axes. So this is our object, the cube, and this is our camera, which actually views the cube. It's just like making a real life film. You need the people who have the cameras so that they can record the actual footage. So this is our camera that records our footage. And as you can see, here's the camera view. So you can right click on the camera and move it around while holding the right mouse button, and you can actually move objects by right clicking and holding the right mouse button down and moving them over the scene, within the scene. You can right click to return the objects to their original position, or you can move objects then left click to leave them in a different position. So I'm going to undo that. You can also scale objects by pressing the S key, which allows you to scale them, and you can scale objects on the various axes. For example, if you want to scale on the x-axis, you press S, then for S for scale, then X to mean that you're scaling on the x-axis. If you want to scale on the y-axis, then you can press S, then Y. If you want to scale on the z-axis, you can press S, then Z, and so forth. So you can also change the 3D manipulator widget, which is basically this arrows, to be either the scale manipulator, which allows you to scale here on any of the axes, and basically you can also change to the rotate manipulator, which allows you to rotate the object around on the various axes once again. So I guess that's it with the 3D view. No, let me explain what. Okay, so sorry for the confusion. You can also use the shortcut key G for grab to move the object around, and you can use S to scale and R to rotate. So if you do not specify any axes to scale on or rotate or move on, then it will allow you to move in any direction or scale in any direction, and also to rotate in any direction without basing your rotation on a specific axis. So all transformation actually occurs from using the origin of the object as the default pivot point, and the origin is this orange dot, which you can see here. And 3D cursor is this target thing, as I said before, which, sorry, that was confusing, which I just returned to the center. Okay, so basically that's it. And if you do not want to see any of these widgets, if they're confusing, you can click on this button here and toggle them on or off. You can also change the view transform orientation to the view, as you can see, or the normal, and I will explain all of this later on, or gimbal or local. For now we're going to leave it as global. And when you go to the view options here, you can see all the options that allow you to manipulate the view in the current 3D view window. I hope that's not confusing. For example, if you want to see the front view, you can click here or press numpad 1 and it allows you to go into the front view. You can also toggle between view types such as perspective and orthographic, and perspective is the default view, which is how we see it, and orthographic is a more accurate view, which is actually how objects are, and as you can see the difference. So that's orthographic view and this is perspective view. So originally we were in perspective view, and we can toggle between orthographic view and perspective view by also pressing the numpad 5 key on our keyboard. The view type is specified, the view type is indicated here at the top, and the object name is actually shown at the bottom left. So the view type is shown on the top left and the object name is shown on the bottom left. So this is the current frame which we are in, and if we move to the next frame, then you can see this value changes to 2 from 1. And that basically means that this shows us the current frame, which is in parentheses, and the name of the current active object. Okay, so this select allows you to access various select tools. For example, if you want to select a specific type of objects, you can select all mesh type objects by clicking on select all by type, then mesh. Then you can also select all by layer and select pattern, links, and all that stuff. So the object contains the object details, and you can convert this object. Maybe if it was a text object, you can convert it to a mesh, but mainly you just need to master the shortcut keys because it is a faster way of doing things. This here is the various modes that you can use. The weight paint mode is used to allocate different weightings, if that's a word, used to allocate different weights, I guess. And this is mainly important maybe when you're creating hair and you create As you can see, the cube turns blue, and you can create various weight groups. For example, if you want the hair to only appear on the top face, you can make this have full weight. This doesn't make much sense to you right now probably, but I will explain the details later on. This is just a basic overview. Texture paint allows you to paint various textures. On your object. Vertex paint allows you to also paint, and sculpt mode actually allows you to sculpt your object, and all of this we will go over each and every single one of them in a different tutorial, because time is of essence and I don't want to confuse you with too much detail. So basically I'm just going to go over this quickly. So the edit mode is where you can actually edit your object and is mainly used for modeling, and you can see you can select each and every single one of your vertices here, and to change the vertex of the select mode, you can click on any of this. This means that we are under the vertex select mode. This is the edge select mode where you select the edges, and this is the face select mode where you select the faces. This allows you to see through the object basically and select faces that are otherwise not visible from the current view. For example, I can select the back face without actually having to rotate through this view, and this will be rather important when doing some modeling, and I will explain all of that in later tutorials. But this basically allows you to limit the selection to visible, as you can see from the tooltip text here. So you can turn it on and off. So edit mode is where you can edit your object or objects and their appearances, and you can move the various faces. You can also scale them to create various objects. For example, you can see I just created what is this? Something. Anyway, so object mode basically just allows you to edit the entire object, while edit mode allows you to edit the finer details, which is the individual vertices, edges, or faces. Okay, this is the shading mode, which is the viewport shading, and you can change it from solid to wireframe, which is this, and shows you each and every single edge of the object. You can change it to bounding box, which shows the bounding box, which once again we will go over in later tutorials. This allows you to change to textured mode, and this shows you how the light affects the object. So this is basically just good for positioning your light within the scene so that you can have a good render. Next on is this, which allows you to manipulate the pivot points, which is the transformation points. For example, what you want to be used as the pivot point for actually maybe scaling, rotating, and doing all that stuff. And you can change it to bounding box center, and the bounding box is basically the cube that the rectangle, the cuboid actually, that you saw covering these when we went to bounding box here. So if you change this to bounding box center, then it will make the pivot point the center of this bounding box. This will make the pivot point the 3D cursor position. For example, if the cursor was here, then the object will be rotated, scaled, and translated based. Actually, then rotated and scaled. Sorry for the confusion. Based on this cursor position. Yeah, and this is the active element pivot point, which is currently, for example, if this is in edit mode, the active element is actually this face, which is selected, and when we scale, it scales based on this face. Median point is actually the actual center point of the object, which is indicated by the origin, and individual origins is for maybe in edit mode. Each and every single face has its different origin. For example, this face has its center when you draw a line diagonally from here to here, and another one from here to here. Sorry, let me go here, go into wireframe. From, if you draw a diagonal line from here to here, and another, sorry, if you draw a diagonal line from this top right to this bottom left, and one from this top left to this bottom right, then you will find a point at which they intersect, and that is the origin point of this current face. So scaling on the individual origins will actually use the various origins of the different faces to scale. I hope that made sense. These other things are not too important. Actually, everything is important, but I will explain what this does. This allows you to toggle proportional editing on and off, which allows you to edit more smoothly, and I will also explain that later on. And this is a snapping tool which allows you to snap various objects in different ways, which I will also explain later on, and you will also perhaps discover on your own while experimenting. So feel free to experiment on anything. Okay, so now that we've gone over the 3D view, I'm going to explain what each and every single one of these does, and then finally I'll explain the basics of this timeline, and our tutorial will end there. And you will probably have familiarized yourself with Blender for the most part and have understood most of the things. So this is the render. This is the properties panel, first of all, and this is the render settings. This allows you to render the animation and play the animation. It's the same as this render option here at the top. This is the scene information and this is the world information, for example the sky, and you can toggle environment lighting, indirect lighting, which will be explained later on, and ambient occlusion. This is the object settings, where you can change the settings of the object, change the name of the object, transform the object here, and the layers, the render layers, I think you can change between the various layers. You can toggle between the various layers here. You can also give the object transform locks. For example, if you lock bees on the x-axis, then it means it can't move on the x-axis at all. It can only move on the y and the z-axis. So if you lock these two, it can only move on the y-axis. But worry not, because all this will be explained later on, and I'm just going to go over this very quickly because this has been a very long tutorial and I don't want to bore you too much. Sorry. So this constraint, this is the constraint settings that allows you to add various constraints. For example, transform constraints, you can copy the location of another object, and all these can do different things. Actually, limit the distance and tracking. You can do all these kinds of stuff, which I don't want to confuse you with, but just know it's for the constraint settings. This is the modifier settings, where you can add different modifiers to our object. This here is the object data, where you have your vertex groups and shape keys and UV maps and vertex colors and all these kinds of things, which apparently sound very confusing right now, but fear not, once again I will explain them later on. This is the materials panel, where you can change the materials of your object. For example, I want my object to be this, maybe say this dark blue color. You can just give it the object, give it the materials here, and yeah, basically that's it. So the texture option allows you to add textures to your object, and this allows you to add the texture to your material, which is basically a simple way of saying using the texture as an what's the right word, using the texture as your material, something, yeah, anyway, it's like using your texture as the material but with the texture settings. Sorry, that's confusing once again. All these things will be more clear later on, and hope you have a good time. I said that right early, didn't I? Anyway, these are the particle settings, and you can add different particles here by clicking this plus button and this minus button to remove the particle system. And these are basically just important for maybe particle effects and smoke trails and fire and stuff like that. And this is the physics panel, where you can specify the physics type for your object. Maybe if it's a collision object, a cloth object, and basically this just runs physics simulations, and you can use the various physics types, which we will go over once again in another tutorial. So that's it for this properties window, and now we are going to the last editor type, which is the timeline. So the timeline is basically where you can add keyframes for your animation, and keyframes are basically positions from point A to point B. For example, if our cube thing here was moving from point A, which is here, to point B, then we will need a keyframe, maybe at frame 1 here and another keyframe here. So this is point A, point B. So keyframes are actually usually set based on timing, which is why people say animation requires a lot of timing. There is a set frame rate, which you can specify under this render settings. Sorry, I did not mention it. For example, this is 24 frames per second, and this basically means that every second, 24, for each second, 24 of these frames will be played. For example, if you insert a keyframe here, and you can insert a keyframe by pressing I, by the way, and I will insert a location keyframe under frame 1. Then if you want the animation to be 1 second, then you will go to frame 25, which is basically just, this is it, basically just 24 frames later. Or you can just type in the starting frame, for example 1 plus 24, which is the frame rate, and this will give you 25. So this is the starting frame where your animation begins, and this is the ending frame where your animation ends. Let's say my animation is 25 frames long. So I move my object to point B and press I, add another keyframe, and now our object is animated, and this is a 1 second animation where our object moves from point A to point B within a time frame of 1 second, which is 24 frames. So from frame 1 to frame 25 is basically 25 frames. So this is actually supposed to be 24. Sorry for the confusion. So anyway, I hope you get the point. I think I've recorded this for too long and I need to go stretch, so I guess I hope and really hope you got the point. So anyway, from frame 1 to frame 24 is 1 second, because you start counting 1, 2, 3 up to 24, and it's going to be 24 frames. Sorry for the confusion once again. So anyway, now we have our animated cube. Now to play the animation, you can play it by clicking on this play button here, and this plays the animation forwards rather, and this you can pause the animation, and you can play it backwards this way by clicking that, and you can also jump to the next frame, and you can jump to the next frame by using this, or next keyframe, sorry, by using this button. Then you can also jump to the last frame in the frame range here. This basically means the last frame indicated by this end, so it moves to frame 24, which is our ending frame. So the last part of this tutorial is how do you render your animation. So let's say I am not going to explain too much of this, but I am just going to position this camera above somewhere here, then zoom out. Sorry if I'm going too quickly. Once again, this tutorial has been too long, so I don't want to bore you. Okay, so let's say now we want to render our animation. We can see our cube moving from point A to point B. So now we go to this render settings, and we can change the resolution to 100%, but I can choose from a preset, and I'll choose HDTV 720p, and you can choose the output folder here, and I will choose my Blender stuff folder, create a new directory, name it introduction. Actually I didn't name it, but anyway, name it whatever you want to name it. Then the name of my animation, let's say introduction to Blender animation, and I can click accept, and now I can see my cube thing moving here when I play the animation in the viewport. And to render the animation, you should render your animation as an image, as much as you will feel tempted to render it as a movie file or rather video file, do not do that, because then if you're rendering and in the middle of your render something happens and it's a video file, then the whole file will be corrupted. So it is often recommended that you render your animation as an image file, and often PNG, because PNG preserves all the quality and allows transparency and all that stuff. But you can also use JPEG if you know what you're doing, but I would recommend PNG. So now that we've done that and we've set the location for our animation, you can just click here or press Ctrl F12 to render your animation. So hopefully this tutorial helped you, and I'm going to render this animation and post it at the end of the video, just for you to see what you can do as your first animation with Blender. So welcome to the Blender community. If you are a beginner, welcome to the Blender community, and feel free to ask any questions. And thank you for watching this video. Please like, comment and subscribe. This is Alan Jeremy for Deaflix Incorporated, and thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.